For the record, my name is Olin Reyes, Grade 3 Survey Technician, Compact Survey Division, Cold Environment and Glacial Subfield. I've held that certification for 19 years. Before that, I worked 3 seasons on the Corundal ice shelf as a laborer, which is how I learned that the cold doesn't care what you think of yourself, and that the fastest way to make a bad situation worse is to run. I'm telling you this so you understand what I'm about to describe isn't heroism. It isn't bravery. I don't have a handler's certification. I've never held a containment class commission. What I have is a surveying instrument kit, a thermal underlayer that's been repaired in 4 different places, and a notebook that I write in with a pressure stylus because it works at minus 32 where the digital pad doesn't. I am not an interesting man. I am a man who is good at sitting still in cold places and writing down numbers. The board has asked me to begin at the beginning. I'll try. I was assigned to Outer Station Vethkal on the 14th day of the 7th cycle, Standard Reckoning. Vethkal is a glacial survey hub on the frontier margin, one of those postings nobody volunteers for, 2.5 light weeks from the nearest compact station of any size, perched at the edge of a glacial shelf that the survey division has been trying to properly map for 11 years. The ice moves. The survey in time, they set their instruments, the ice shifts, and 3 months of calibration data slides into a fissure. Then they send another team. I was the other team. Station Commander Britta Soloth met me at the docking bay. She was a compact woman, somewhere in her mid-50s, with the flat-eyed steadiness of someone who has been running a difficult posting for too long and has learned to project confidence as a cost-saving measure. She had a datapad in her hand before I'd finished unclipping my kit bag from the cargo hook. She said, "You've been briefed on the cave system." I said I had. She said, "Then you know we have an active containment situation in Sectors 7 through 14, which is the primary survey zone." I said I was aware of it. She gave me a look that I recognized, the look that says the person looking at you has already categorized you and found you insufficient for the task. But the paperwork is filed and there's nothing to be done about it. She said, "The previous survey team was evacuated after a Vrail adult made contact with lead technician Porth at the Sector 9 junction. The team before that turned back at the Sector 7 entrance without completing instrument placement. 2 contracted handler teams have attempted formal containment protocols and neither completed the engagement." She paused and looked at her datapad. The 3rd contracted declined to enter the system after reviewing the prior team's reports. I said, "What's the Vrail's estimated territory boundary?" She said the surveys had been incomplete and they couldn't determine that. I said, "What about the Keth pair?" The logs mentioned a subadult Keth pair at the Sector 11 shelf. She said, "They've been confirmed at Sectors 9, 10, and 11. They were present when Porth's team evacuated and did not pursue." I noted that. "A pack predator pair that chooses not to pursue a retreating group is communicating something worth paying attention to," I said. "And the Sorvai?" She said, "The Sorvai is unconfirmed. 1 visual contact Sector 8, 1 partial resonance signature. Its status in relation to the other 2 species is unclear. Sorvai are not typical cave-dwelling animals, and the behavioral ecology literature doesn't have a good framework for a lone individual in a mixed species configuration," I said. "That's interesting," she said. "Is it?" It wasn't a question. She handed me the access key for the survey storage bay and told me orientation would be at the 6th hour. I thanked her and carried my kit bag to my quarters, which were at the far end of the station's residential corridor, and smelled of recycled air and the particular mineral cold of a building that sits on glacier ice year-round. I want to be clear about my thinking at that stage, because I've been asked to describe it, and I don't want to overstate it. I wasn't confident. I wasn't performing calm. I was genuinely trying to figure out the logistics of the survey, because the survey was the job, and the job was why I was there. I have a daughter at home. She was 12 at the time of this posting, and the contract stipend from a completed Vethkal glacial survey was going to pay for her enrollment in the Corundal Technical Academy the following cycle. That was my primary motivation, not pride, not any particular quality of character. I needed the hours to be complete and the survey to be certified, and the only thing standing between me and those outcomes was a cave full of predators that had sent better credentialed people running. I thought about that on my first night at Vethkal. I thought about it the way you think about a mechanical problem. What are the variables? What do I actually know? What am I assuming that might not be true? I reviewed Porth's evacuation report from the station archive. I read the 2 handler team assessments. I read the third team's refusal memo, which was brief and professionally worded and which, reading between its careful lines, communicated genuine alarm. What I kept coming back to was the Keth pair not pursuing when Porth's team evacuated. That mattered. That was a data point. Pack predators who choose not to pursue a retreating group are communicating something, even if it isn't the thing you could expect. They weren't protecting territory. If they were, they'd have pursued to the boundary and stopped. They weren't hunting. If they were, the pursuit instinct would have engaged. They were watching. The retreat had satisfied something they needed satisfied, and once it was satisfied, they'd stopped. I also thought about the Sorvai. Slosvai is unusual. The standard behavioral literature says Sorvai are colony adjacent. They function poorly in isolation. Their nervous system literally requires periodic resonance contact with others of their kind to regulate properly. A lone Sorvai sharing a cave system with a Vrail adult and a Keth pair is an anomaly, and anomalies in behavioral ecology usually mean the system has found an equilibrium that the standard literature didn't account for. The Sorvai had found something in that cave system that approximated what it needed. The question was what? The Vrail was the one that worried me, not because of the handler team reports. Handler teams bring equipment, pheromone emitters, containment signals, all of which register as threat architecture to most apex predators, but because of Vrail adult in a bounded territory with two other predator. Species present is, under normal conditions, is either dominant or displaced. The prior handler teams had arrived with equipment that announced aggression in the chemical and sonic language that Vrail adults are evolved to respond to. Of course they'd engaged. Of course the teams had run. I wanted to understand what happened if you arrived with nothing that announced aggression. The behavioral literature didn't have a good answer to that, because apparently nobody had tried it, or at least nobody had tried it and survived long enough to publish. I wrote these thoughts in my notebook before I went to sleep on the first night. Then I went to sleep because the survey started at the 4th hour the next morning, and I functioned poorly when under-rested. I want to describe the cave system because I think it matters to what happened later. Sectors 7 through 14 of the Vethkal Glacial Survey are a connected series of ice and rock chambers formed along a deep shelf fracture. The ice is old. Pre-settlement old. The kind of ice that has been there long enough to acquire a particular quality of silence that new ice doesn't. Have a density of quiet that you feel in your ears as much as here. The chambers range from roughly 8 meters across at the narrower junctions to a main central chamber that the prior survey teams had estimated at 50 meters wide and 30 meters from floor to ceiling. The floor is a combination of compressed glacial ice, exposed rock shelf, and in the lower sectors, a partial meltwater channel that freezes and thaws in a cycle tied to the geothermal activity below. The walls in some sectors have a crystalline structure, ice formations built up over centuries, geometric and intricate, that catch the helmet lamplight and throw it back in colors you don't expect to see underground. It is very cold. It is very quiet. The acoustics are unusual. Sounds carry further than you'd expect in some directions and die completely in others, which is a property of the ice and rock interfaces that I found professionally interesting and personally useful. A person who knows how the sound moves in a cave system like that. One can determine a great deal about what's around them without having to look. I entered Sector 7 at the 4th hour of the second day, carrying my instrument kit, my notebook, my pressure stylus, and a thermos of heated extract. I did not carry a weapon. The Survey Division's standard issue for cold environment posting includes a signal flare and a low-intensity deterrent emitter, and I took both because regulations require it, but I want the board to understand that I did not go into that cave with any particular plan involving either of them. My plan was to place my Sector 7 instruments, sit down, drink my extract, and write in my notebook. Then, if nothing had killed me, move to Sector 8 and do the same. The Sector 7 chamber is the narrowest in the survey zone, a passage roughly 4 meters wide at its widest, with walls close enough that you can touch both sides at once if you stretch. The ceiling drops in places to about 2.5 meters. It should have felt confining. I found it didn't. The ice in that sector has a faint blue-green quality in the helmet light, and the sound of the geothermal water moving far below carried up through the floor as a very faint, very steady rhythm that I can only describe as breathing. I placed the Sector 7 array in 30 minutes and then sat down against the wall and took out my notebook. I wrote for a while. Field notes mostly, observations about ice structure, sensor placement angles, estimated calibration drift rates. The kind of writing that keeps the hands busy while the mind works. I drank some extract. I listened to the ice breathe. Nothing came into Sector 7 that day. I moved to Sector 8. The Sorvai found me in Sector 8. I had placed my second instrument array and was sitting on my kit bag, writing up the Sector 7 readings, when I became aware of something on the shelf above and to my left. The Sector 8 chamber has a secondary rock shelf at roughly 4 meters, elevation running along the north wall for about 20 meters. The Sorvai was on that shelf. I could see its eyes, compound amber, refracting the light from my helmet lamp in a way that made them look like two small suns set into bronze, and I could see the faint outline of its carapace, which was the color of old bronze, with a faint iridescence along the joint lines between the plate sections. I wrote, Sorvai confirmed, Sector 8, North Shelf, elevation approximately 4 meters, individual present and stationary, no vocalization, antenna array active. Then I kept writing my Sector 7 numbers. The Sorvai watched me for approximately 40 minutes. At the end of that time, it moved along the shelf to the closest to where I was sitting and extended one antenna toward me. The antenna was long, nearly half the animal's body length, and it moved with a deliberate, measured quality, like someone reaching carefully across a table for something breakable. The tip made contact with my left shoulder through the thermal underlayer. I felt a vibration, not sound, below sound, a frequency that traveled through the fabric and into the muscle beneath, brief, almost questioning. Then the antenna withdrew. I kept writing. There was a sound next, not a vocalization exactly, more like a resonance in the rock, a frequency that I felt in my back teeth rather than heard with my ears. It lasted about 3 seconds. Then the Sorvai settled on the shelf and was still, its eyes still on me, its carapace shifting to a slightly wider surface orientation, like a plant turning toward light. I finished my Sector 7 number. I moved to Sector 9. I want to be honest about the Keth pair. I was more nervous about them than I was about the Sorvai, because the Sorvai had shown me something interpretable. It had made deliberate, non-aggressive contact and then settled. The Keth pair were subadults, and subadult pack predators can be unpredictable in ways that adult animals usually aren't. They haven't fully settled into their behavioral patterns yet. They push limits. They test things. They make decisions that adult animals would have already concluded weren't worth making. The Keth pair were in the Sector 9 junction when I arrived. They were sitting in the middle of the passage, side by side facing me. They were about 2/3 of adult Keth size, which meant they were roughly waist-high at the shoulder and significantly longer than that from nose to tail. Their slate-gray fur had a faint iridescence in the helmet lamplight, a silvering at the tips of the longer guard hairs. Their dew claws were retracted. Their ears were forward. I stopped walking. I set down my kit bag. I sat down on the ice, cross-legged, about 6 meters in front of them. We looked at each other for a while. I wrote in my notebook, Keth subadult pair, Sector 9 junction. Both present, non-aggressive posture, dew claws retracted, no vocalization. Making eye contact in alternation, one watching while the other looks away, then switching. Behavioral note. This alternation pattern is consistent with monitoring rather than threat assessment. They are not deciding whether to attack. They are deciding something else. The one on the left, I started calling them left and right in my notes for tracking purposes, and later in the story I gave them proper names, but at this stage they were left and right. Left took 2 steps forward and stopped. Right watched. I kept writing. Left came 2 more steps, stopped. The head dropped slightly, a posture I recognized from the behavioral literature as active olfactory assessment. They were reading the air around me, building a chemical picture of what I was. I sat still and let them build it. I didn't smell like pheromone emitters or sonic deterrent arrays or any of the equipment signatures that had preceded me into this cave system. I smelled like thermal underlayer and instrument grease and the particular extract blend from the station mess that I'd been drinking all morning. I said very quietly, "That's all right." Left sat down. There was a pause, a full breath's worth, and then right sat down a moment later, as if the decision had needed to go through both of them. I finished my Sector 8 numbers, then started my Sector 9 instrument placement. The Keth pair watched the entire time with the focused patience of young animals that haven't yet decided whether patience is worth their while but are willing to find out. When I finished and picked up my kit bag to move to Sector 10, left stood, and then moved to my left side at a distance of about 2 meters, right moved to my right side at the same distance. They flanked me all the way to Sector 10. At Sector 10 I sat down and drank some of my extract and wrote, The Keth pair have adopted a parallel movement pattern relative to my survey path. They are positioning as flanking animals. This is consistent with subadult pack behavior, in which an unaffiliated individual of unclear status is treated as a provisional pack member pending evaluation. I appear to be in an evaluation period. Behaviorally, the correct response is to continue doing exactly what I'm doing. I will note that the warmth off their coats is noticeable. The Sector 10 ambient temperature is -16. This is an unexpected logistical benefit. So I did. I kept doing what I was doing. The Vrail was in the main chamber, Sector 11, the large central space I described earlier, and I did not see it on the second day I heard it. Or rather, I felt it the same quality of resonance I'd felt from the Sorvai's Intentatap, but lower, deeper, coming through the floor ice rather than through the rock wall. A subsonic vocalization that meant my chest vibrated faintly while I worked, not painfully, more like standing too close to a very large engine that is idling. A presence announcement rather than a threat. At least, that's how I read it. I noted it and kept working. I went back to the station entrance at the end of that session and came out into -20. 8 air with all my instruments placed through Sector 10, both Keth animals having escorted me back to Sector 7 before turning around, and my field notes running to 4 pages of observations that I thought might actually be professionally interesting. Sumer Solet reviewed my field notes the following morning. I know this because her aide left a message on my station terminal asking me to come to her office. She said, "Completed Sector 7, 8, 9, and 10 instrument placements," I said. "Yes," she said. "On your first day in the cave system," I said. The Keth pair assisted with navigation in Sectors 9 and 10. They know the passages better than I do. They moved toward the wider sections ahead of me, which saved some time on layout. There was a silence that told me this had not been the right thing to say. Commander Soleth said, "The Keth pair, the containment classified subadult predator animals. They assisted you," I said. "They flanked me during instrument placement. I don't know if that counts as assistance in any formal sense, but they knew where the passages widened, and they moved that way without being asked, which saved me some time. I want to note in my log that their behavior during the session was non-aggressive throughout." Another silence. She said, "Mr. Reyes, this posting requires careful," I said. "I know what it requires. I need 6 more weeks to complete the survey and calibrate the instruments. The animals in the cave system are not behaving aggressively toward me. I don't have any reason to believe that will change if I keep doing what I'm doing," she said. "What you're doing is sitting down on the ice and writing in a notebook," I said. "Yes," she said, "without protective equipment, without containment signals, without any of the standard precaution framework for this class of survey environment," I said. "The containment signals are what triggered the evacuation of Porth's team. Sector 7 has the resonance signatures to prove it. The frequency spike is in the instrument record from the session before Porth's evacuation. The Vrail vocalized in direct response to the pheromone emitter the team deployed. The emitter registered as territorial aggression. Without the emitter, there's no trigger. The standard precaution framework is what the animals have been responding to." She looked at me for a long time. She said, "You are a glacial survey technician." I said, "Yes," she said. "Not a behavioral ecologist," I said. "No. But I've been working in cold environments for 19 years, and most of the things that can kill you in a cold environment don't want to kill you specifically. They just want you to do something that looks like a threat. If you don't do anything that looks like a threat, most of the time they leave you alone. The ones that don't aren't in this cave system, or they'd have dealt with the Vrail already, and he wouldn't be here." She sent me back to the cave. I think she expected the situation to resolve itself. That is to say, I think she expected the Vrail to eventually do something that would end my survey, either by actively threatening me in a way I couldn't ignore or by simply occupying the sectors I needed to reach. I'm reconstructing her thinking from her actions and from some of the records the board has reviewed, so I want to be clear that this is my interpretation, not a statement of fact. But the subsequent events are consistent with that interpretation. What actually happened over the following 6 months is in my field notes, which I understand the board has read in full. I'll summarize the significant points. The Sorvai, I named her Vel after my daughter's middle name, because she had a habit of showing up silently and sitting above me at an angle that reminded me of the way Vel sits on the high shelf in her room at home when she's watching me work. Vel started visiting me in Sector 8 every session from the 3rd week onward. The antenna tap became a routine. I'd be writing or placing instruments, and I'd feel the vibration through my shoulder, and I'd say something like "good morning," or "still cold in here," and she'd settle onto the floor beside me. In the 5th week, she started staying on the floor for the duration of my Sector 8 sessions, rather than returning to the shelf. She didn't interfere with the instruments. She seemed to be reading something from the resonance the arrays produced. Her antenna array would orient toward the active sensors in a way that looked deliberate, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. In the 8th week, she started carrying small objects, pebbles, fragments of old ice, once a piece of survey marker ribbon that one of the earlier teams had left behind. In Sector 8, wedged into a crack in the ice wall and apparently preserved there for some time. She'd bring an object close, set it in front of me, and then wait. I always picked them up and examined them and put them in my jacket pocket, because it seemed like the correct response, accepting what's offered, acknowledging the transaction. By the end of the survey period, I had 11 pebbles, 3 ice fragments, and the ribbon piece. I have them here, if the board would like to see them. They're in my left jacket pocket. The board is welcome to examine them. I don't expect they'll tell the board much beyond what the field notes already document, but they seem like the kind of evidence that should be present in this proceeding. The Keth pair, I named them Tev and Oreth, because left and right became confusing in the field notes once they started moving independently. Settled into a pattern within the first month that did not vary much across the entire survey period. They flanked me during instrument work. When I sat still and wrote notes, they sat on either side of me, usually with some part of their body in contact with my legs or my kit bag, close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off their fur through my underlayer. The cold in the cave system runs between -12 and -19, depending on the sector and the time of day. Tev and Oreth ran at approximately body temperature, which is considerably warmer than the ambient air. By the 2nd month, I had stopped wearing the additional thermal layer I'd been doubling up on for the deepest sectors, because the flanking warmth made it unnecessary. I noted this in my field notes under the heading Logistical Benefits of Current Working Arrangement. I don't know if Commander Solith read that particular note. Based on her subsequent actions, I suspect she did. Tev was the more investigative of the two. She was the one who'd stepped forward first in Sector 9, and she maintained that quality of forward curiosity throughout the survey. She would often move ahead of me in passages, stop, look back, and then continue in a way that I eventually interpreted as route scouting. Oreth tended to stay close, within touching distance on my right side, and had developed a habit of setting her chin on my shoulder when I was sitting still, which I found more touching than I had expected to find anything on this posting. She did it first in month 2, and I had been so focused on not reacting that I had written approximately 1 page of very precise survey numbers before I allowed myself to acknowledge that there was a subadult apex predator sleeping on my shoulder. I still have those numbers. They are, my supervisor tells me, exceptionally accurate, the Vrail. I want to take some time with this because I think the board deserves a complete account, and because the Vrail is at the center of the events that led to this review session. A Vrail adult is large. The behavioral literature puts them at 4 to 6 meters in length, depending on sex and age, with a ridge plate array along the spine and shoulder. They can lock into a raised threat configuration. The plates are copper dark. I later learned the precise term is ferrous ochre, a pigmentation linked to the ion content of their preferred prey's body chemistry, and the eyes are amber, with a vertical pupil that contracts to a hairline in strong light and expands in low light to something like a full copper disc. They have a quadrupedal movement pattern at low speed and a bipedal forelimb extended pattern at high speed. Their primary vocalization is subsonic, felt rather than heard. Their secondary vocalization, the one they use rarely, in which the behavioral literature discusses with notable brevity, and something that reads, to my untrained eye, like uncertainty, is audible. I'll come back to that. The Vrail in the Vethkal cave system, I named him Sek eventually, for reasons I'll explain, was at the upper end of the size estimate. He was approximately 5.5 meters from nose to tail. His ridge plates in full raised configuration would have cleared the Sector 11 chamber ceiling with only a meter of clearance. In the handler team reports, the description of those plates raising was what had caused the immediate evacuation response. Reading those reports on my first night, I had thought, yes, that would do it. A wall of ferrous ochre plate armor snapping upright on a 5.5 meter predator in a confined space would produce a reliable evacuation of any reasonable person. I first came within visual Sec at the end of the third week. I was in Sector 11, placing the main chamber instrument array, a more complex setup than the sector instruments, requiring careful angle calibration and 2 separate ground plane anchors. And he came through the Sector 12 passage and stopped at the junction. The passage mouth framed him. His plates were partially raised, not full threat configuration, but elevated enough that I could see the individual plates clearly, their edges catching my helmet lamplight. The Keth pair, Tev and Orith, were flanking me at the time. They both stopped moving and sat. Vel was somewhere above me on the chamber wall. I couldn't see her exact position, but I could feel the resonance from her position shifting. A change in the quality of the vibration in the rock at my back that told me she had moved. I stopped what I was doing. I sat down on the ice. Sek was approximately 15 meters away. His ridge plates were partially raised. His amber eyes in the low light of the chamber were fully dilated, copper discs, wide and still. He was not vocalizing in any range I could hear, but the subsonic resonance in the floor had changed quality. It was louder, more present, and it had a rhythmic quality that the general chamber idle resonance didn't have. That was him. That was the active vocalization. I opened my notebook and wrote, first confirmed visual contact with Vrail adult, Sector 11 main chamber junction. Individual is large, at or above upper end of literature estimate. Ridge plates partially elevated, approximately 40% of full extension. No audible vocalization but subsonic resonance, active and rhythmic, distinct from passive territory vocalization. Feel it clearly through the ice. The Keth pair are sitting. Tev is pressed against my left leg. The Sorvai is on the chamber wall, position unconfirmed. Resonance presence felt in the rock at my back. Individual is not advancing, is not retreating, is watching. This is the same thing I'm doing. I kept writing. I wrote my Sector 10 numbers. I'd been reviewing them in my head during the instrument placement, and there were 2 readings I wanted to cross-reference before the data could shift with temperature change. I wrote for a while. I looked up periodically. Sek was still at the junction. His ridge plates over the course of my note-taking had dropped slightly. Not to neutral, but lower than when he'd arrived. I noted the change and kept writing. After approximately 45 minutes, he withdrew into the Sector 12 passage. I wrote, individual withdrew after approximately 45 minutes. Ridge plate elevation decreased during the observation period, from approximately 40% to approximately 25%. No aggressive contact, no advance. The subsonic resonance decreased in intensity during the withdrawal and returned to passive territory quality after he cleared the junction, marking his first successful Sector 11 session. Then I finished placing the main chamber array and went back to the station. This sequence, Sek appearing, me sitting, Sek's plates dropping over time, Sek withdrawing, repeated 14 more times over the following 2 months. Each time, the initial ridge plate elevation was slightly lower than the previous session. Each time, the withdrawal took slightly longer. He was spending more time in the junction, watching before deciding to leave. By the 15th session, his plates when he arrived were at what I had started estimating as a neutral position, not raised for threat, not fully flat, but the resting orientation of an animal that is present and aware and not yet decided about something. I had been writing about this progression in my field notes throughout, and in the margin of the 15th session's entry I wrote, he is making a decision. I don't know what the decision is, but it has been in process for 2 months. I can wait. On the 16th session, he didn't withdraw. I had been in the Sector 11 chamber for approximately 2 hours, finishing the final calibration sequence on the main array. A delicate process that requires steady hands and sustained attention and tends to produce a quality of focused stillness in me that I don't always manage to achieve in other contexts. When I became aware that the subsonic resonance in the floor had changed quality, it was closer, more immediate. I looked up. Sek was 6 meters away. He was lying down. His ridge plates were flat to his spine, fully flat, pressed close, not raised at any extension I could measure, and his chin was resting on the ice floor, which lowered his eye level to approximately mine as I sat cross-legged beside the array. His amber eye was on me, I wrote, with my hand as steady as I could keep it. Vrail adult in full rest posture, ridge plates completely flat, 6 meters, chin on ice, eye contact. This is not a posture I've seen in the literature for adult animals in the presence of an unaffiliated individual. Tev pressed against my left leg. Orith behind me, chin on my right shoulder. Vel on my right, I think. I can feel the resonance from her plate array at about 2 o'clock. I sat very still. The calibration could wait. Sek's breathing was slow. The ambient temperature in the main chamber was -14. Each of his long exhalations produced a faint ice crystal mist that caught my helmet light for a moment and then dispersed. His ridge plates, flat against his spine, had a texture up close that I hadn't been able to see from distance. Individual plates overlapping like stone roof tiles. Each one a slightly different shade within the ferrous ochre range, darker at the base and lighter at the edge, I said very quietly. All right, then, his eye. His breathing didn't change, as he was simply there. I named him Sek that evening, sitting in my quarters after the session. The name belonged to Vel's father, my father-in-law, who passed 4 years ago, and who was the most patient man I've ever known. He used to say that the surest way to earn anything worth having was to be willing to sit with the discomfort of not yet having it. He was talking about relationships, mostly, and about the years before my wife and I finally got our logistics sorted, but I found the principle has broad application. The man could sit in a room and make you feel, somehow, that the room was safer for his being in it. That was Sek. That was the quality. Sek and I sat together in the Sector 11 chamber for approximately 3 hours that first time. Then I packed up my calibration instruments and walked back through Sectors 10, 9, 8, and 7, and the Keth pair flanked me the whole way, and Vel rode my right shoulder as far as Sector 8 before returning to her shelf with an antenna tap that I had come to recognize as farewell. Until tomorrow, and when I came out of the cave entrance into the Vethkal exterior air, it was -28, and the station lights were on, and Commander Solith was standing at the perimeter barrier with her hands behind her back. She watched me walk to the station entrance. She didn't say anything that evening. She said things the following morning. She said, "The instrument data from yesterday's session shows a Vrail adult in confirmed resting posture at a distance of 6 meters from your position in the main chamber." I said, "Yes," she said. "That animal drove 2 full handler teams out of that cave system and caused Porth to file a formal trauma report," I said. "I believe the handler teams used containment protocols that the animals interpreted as territorial aggression. I haven't used any containment protocols. The resonance signatures in the sector records should document the causal relationship," she said. "What you have used is a notebook," I said, "and a thermos. The survey is nearly complete. I have 4 sectors left to calibrate," she said. "This situation cannot continue," I said. "Which situation?" she said. "A grade 3 survey technician cohabitating with 3 containment, classified apex predator species in an active survey zone without certification, without oversight, without any of the standard," I said. "The survey zone is the reason I'm here. The animals were in the survey zone before I arrived. My presence isn't the anomaly. The anomaly is that the prior survey approaches provoked responses I'm not provoking. The animals themselves haven't changed." She looked at me in the way she had, of looking at things that were not cooperating with her management framework, a particular combination of frustration and something that I read as reluctant respect, though I may have been projecting. She said, "I'm going to file for a behavioral assessment review." I said, "That's your prerogative," she said. "In the meantime, I want you accompanied into the cave system," I said. "I'll need to clear that with the animals first." The silence that followed was long enough that I felt I should clarify, I said. "The Vravel in particular has established a territorial boundary pattern that he communicates via ridge plate configuration. A new individual entering the space without prior orientation would trigger a threat response, which is consistent with everything that's happened before my arrival. I'd need to introduce any additional personnel gradually, over multiple sessions, the way I was introduced, which wasn't planned, I want to be clear. It was just what happened when I sat down and kept my hands visible." She said, "Introduce them," I said. "That would add approximately 3 months to the survey timeline." She closed her eyes briefly. She said, "Complete the survey. I will file the review." I completed the survey in 11 more days. The calibration data is in the survey division record and available to this board. It is, I'm told, the most complete glacial mapping of the Vethkal shelf in 11 years of survey attempts, with instrument arrays in all 14 sectors running clean and fully calibrated. I'll let the data speak to that. What I want to address for the board is what happened between the completion of the survey and the filing of the formal reassignment order. Commander Solith's behavioral assessment request came back from the Compact's Wildlife and Ecology Division with a 3-month estimated response, time which is standard for frontier postings with complex multi-species situations. During those 3 months, I remained at Vethkal because my contract ran to the end of the review period, and because nobody told me to leave. I continued making daily visits to the cave system, not for survey work. The survey was complete, but because the instruments needed periodic maintenance checks, and because, honestly, I found the cave easier to work in than the station. It was quiet. The acoustics were interesting. The animals had become accustomed to my presence, and I had become accustomed to theirs. Sek had begun meeting me at the Sector 10 passage entrance, rather than waiting in the main chamber, which I noted in my field notes as a behavioral evolution, and which I privately found more meaningful than I expected to find most things on a frontier survey posting. I want to note for the record that during those 3 months Commander Soleth made 4 formal attempts to have my tract assignment modified. 2 were reviewed and declined by the Survey Division's Contract Management Office on the grounds that my survey had been completed within scope, and my presence at Vethkals was within normal post-survey instrument maintenance parameters. 1 was referred to the Wildlife and Ecology Division, pending the behavioral assessment response. 1 was filed directly with the Compact Survey Operations Board, which is why we're here. She also, in the 10th month of my posting, contracted a removal team. I learned about the removal team from her aide, who mentioned it in passing while I was checking my mail at the station terminal. He said, "The Casvith team is coming in on the next supply run. Commander wants the cave situation resolved before the assessment team arrives." I said, "Casvith, what's their specialty?" He said, "Apex containment. They've done extensive work on the frontier margin. They specialize in multi-species configurations," I said. "Have they been briefed on the specific behavioral patterns?" The multi-species equilibrium in this cave system isn't typical of rail holding. Territorial formation alongside a Keth pair and a lone Sorvai is documented nowhere in the standard behavioral literature. He looked uncomfortable. He said, "I'm not involved in the briefing process." The Casvith team arrived 4 days later. 6 individuals, full containment equipment, pheromone emitter arrays, sonic deterrents at multiple frequencies, portable barrier systems, and some equipment I didn't recognize that was large enough to require its own cargo pallet. They were professional looking. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people who have done this many times in many difficult places and have learned to conserve energy and attention for what actually requires it. I went to Commander Soleth's office and said, "I'd like to accompany the Casveth team into the cave system." She said, "That won't be necessary," I said. "The animals have established behavioral patterns relative to my presence that aren't documented. Anywhere the Casvith team will have access to. The Vrail in particular," she said. "The Casvith team is experienced with Vrail adults. They have 12 successful Vrail containment operations in their record." I said, "Not with this one. Sek has been in a multi-species cohabitation arrangement for over a year. His behavioral architecture has adapted to a configuration that the standard literature doesn't describe. The trigger responses that Casvith's protocols are built around may not apply," she said. "Thank you for your input, Mr. Reyes. That will be all." I went back to my quarters and sat down on my bunk and thought about what I could do within the scope of my actual authority, which was limited. I was a Grade 3 survey technician. I had no handler certification, no behavioral ecology designation, no formal standing to object to a contracted containment operation. I wrote a note in my field notebook documenting my objection and the date and time and the specific concerns I had expressed to Commander Soleth, because that's what you do when you want a record of having said something before. The outcome proved you right. Then I put on my thermal underlayer and went to wait at the cave entrance. The Casvith team went in at the 3rd hour. I stood at the cave entrance outside the mouth in the -26 air and waited. The entry was efficient. The team moved with good formation discipline, their equipment deployment clean and practiced. I watched them go into Sector 7 and disappear around the first turning. They came back out at the 3rd hour and 11 minutes. I want to be precise about that because I've heard some accounts that say 5 minutes and some that say 2 minutes, and the truth is I checked my field notebook timestamp when they went in and again when they came out, and it was 11 minutes. 11 minutes is a very short time for a 6-person Apex containment team with full equipment. The previous handler teams had lasted considerably longer before evacuating. One had made it as far as Sector 9, which is approximately 140 meters in. The Casvith team had made it, based on where their equipment signatures showed up in the Sector 7 array record, as far as Sector 8. Sector 8 is where Vel lives. The Casveth team lead was a woman named Sareth Duval. She came out of the cave mouth first, moving fast but controlled, not panicked, the way a trained professional moves when withdrawing from a situation that exceeded its parameters, but hasn't yet turned catastrophic. She stopped about 12 meters from the entrance, and the rest of the team came out behind her over the next 90 seconds and assembled at the 12-meter mark without being explicitly instructed to, which tells you something about the quality of their training and also about what they had encountered inside. At the cave mouth, Sek appeared. He came to the entrance threshold and stopped there, filling the mouth of Sector 7's exit passage with his presence in a way that made the rock walls look smaller than they were. His ridge plates were fully raised. The first time I had seen them in full extension in months, and even knowing what I knew about him, the sight had an impact. In full extension, those plates cleared 2 meters above his spine. They locked in place with a sound I felt in my sternum. His amber eyes in the exterior light had contracted to narrow vertical pupils, and they were on the Casveth team. Tev and Orith were visible behind him in the passage, a meter on either side of his haunches. Flanking position, the one I'd seen them take when something required their attention. Vel was on the rock shelf above the entrance, 6-limbed, her carapace plates spread for maximum surface orientation, her compound eyes refracting the exterior light into a complex amber grid. The antenna array was fully extended. The subsonic resonance was audible as vibration in the ice beneath my boots, at the entrance threshold where I was standing. And I knew from 9 months of sitting with it what that particular quality of resonance meant. It was not a territorial advance. It was a boundary declaration. Duval and her team were at the 12-meter mark. None of them were moving. I could see their equipment. The pheromone emitters were dark, which was either a tactical decision or a result of what had happened inside, and the sonic deterrent arrays were powered down. Something had made them stand down the equipment before they reached the cave mouth, and I thought I understood what. Duval was looking at the cave mouth. Then she looked at me. She said, "You're the survey technician." I said, "Yes." She said, "How long has this configuration been established?" I said, "The multi-species cohabitation has been in place since before my arrival. Approximately 14 months, based on the earliest confirmed sightings in the station records. The specific pack behavioral alignment relative to my presence has been developing for about 9 months. She said, "That's the Vrail at the entrance," I said. "Yes," she said. "He's in full territorial defense posture," I said. "He's in full threshold defense posture. There's a distinction. He's not advancing. He's holding the line. He'll maintain this until whatever triggered it is resolved." She said, "Why is he looking at us and not at you?" I said. "Because I'm standing here and you're standing there," she said. "Where's here?" I looked down. I had, without thinking about it particularly, walked to a position approximately 3 meters from the cave entrance while watching the team come out. I was, as it happened, standing just inside what Sek's behavioral patterns had established over 9 months as the approach threshold, the distance at which his subsonic vocalization quality shifted from passive territory monitoring to active presence resonance. I was inside the threshold. The Casveth team was outside it, I said. Inside the perimeter. Duval was quiet for a moment. Her eyes moved from me to Sek and back to me. She said, "Mr. Reyes, would you be willing to walk back out to where we're standing?" I considered this. I thought about what 9 months of threshold mapping had taught me about how Sek read the space. I said, "I'd rather not test what that does to the current configuration." She said, "Right." A pause. Then she looked at her team and said, "Stand down. We're not proceeding today." One of her team members said, "The contract terms," she said, "are contingent on an operational assessment of successful completion probability, and I am completing that assessment now. Stand down." I heard the equipment power down, the faint harmonic of any remaining active emitters going quiet. The deterrent array switches clicking off. The subsonic resonance in the floor shifted incrementally over the following 2 minutes. Sek's ridge plates dropped by maybe 20% of full extension. His pupils in the exterior light had not widened. He was still watching the team, but the resonance quality had changed, the rhythmic active components softening toward the slower, less urgent idle quality that I associated with watchful rest rather than active defense. Duval walked across the glacial flat to stand beside me, which put her also inside the threshold. I watched Sek's eyes track her movement. They moved to her as she approached, assessed, returned to the space between us and her team. His ridge plates tracking her arrival dropped another 5%. She said quietly, "How do you do it?" I said. "Do what?" she said. "Stand here. Like that," I said. "I'm standing on ice. I've been doing that for 19 years. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've run 67 containment operations on the frontier margin, 14 Vrail adults. None of them held a threshold position instead of advancing when the trigger was active." She looked at Sek. "None of them had this configuration." I said, "The configuration is what changed the behavioral parameters. He's not responding to a single species territorial situation. He's responding to a multi-species home range situation where I'm part of the social architecture. Whatever he's doing at the entrance, it isn't about me. It's about them and what they represent to this place," she said. "You've mapped that," I said. "Over about 9 months, yes. It's in my field notes. They're in the station archive," she said. "Commander Solith has station-level access." I said, "Yes." She turned and looked at the station building in the mid-distance, where Commander Solith was visible at the perimeter barrier. Then Duval walked back to her team. She had a conversation I couldn't fully hear at that distance, but I caught the words operational assessment, established anchor, and parameter side standard protocol. Then she walked to the perimeter barrier and spoke with Commander Solath for approximately 4 minutes, and I watched Solath's face from 40 meters while that conversation happened. I watched her face when she understood that the Casksvith team was not going to complete the removal. I want to be precise. I am not a vindictive person, and I did not take pleasure in what I saw on her face. But I want the board to know what I saw, because I think it is relevant to the events that followed. What I saw was not anger. It was something more complicated than anger. The expression of a person who has organized their understanding of a situation carefully and correctly by their own best lights, and has just been informed that the situation is not organized the way they understood it to be. Sek withdrew into the chamber after about 25 minutes. The Keth pair went with him. Vel stayed on the shelf above the entrance for another 5 minutes, her antenna array still extended, and then she went in too. I waited another few minutes, then walked back to the station. Duval's team filed their operational assessment the following morning. I haven't seen the complete document, but the Compact Survey Operations Board has, and based on the questions the board has asked me today, I gather that the assessment contains the phrase established multi-species environmental anchor behavior in reference to my presence in the Vethkal cave system, and that this designation carries specific implications under Compact Wildlife Covenant protocols that complicate any straightforward reassignment. Commander Lost Solith filed her formal reassignment request to the Survey Operations Board 3 days after the Casvith team departed. This review session is the result of that request. I'd like to address the request directly, if the board will permit. The commander's position, as I understand it, is that my continued presence at Outer Station Vethkal constitutes an unmanaged risk, that the behavioral alignment of 3 apex predator species with a single uncertified individual creates an operational hazard for the station and for any personnel who might need to access the survey zone in future. This is a reasonable concern, stated at that level of abstraction. What I'd ask the board to consider is the prior operational record. In the 11 years before my arrival, the survey division made 4 serious attempts to map the Vethkal glacial shelf. None were completed. 2 resulted in formal incident reports. 3 handler and containment teams failed to resolve the cave system situation through standard protocols. The animals were regarded as the primary obstacle to completing the survey. During my posting, the survey was completed. All 14 sectors, fully calibrated, the most complete mapping in the site's 11-year record. The containment incidents during my posting, 0. The formal incident reports involving the cave system animals, 0. The injuries to station personnel, 0. The number of personnel required to manage the situation, 1. Part-time, between instrument maintenance checks. The animals are where they have always been. The survey zone is now mapped, the instruments are running clean. The only thing that has changed since my arrival is that the situation that was consuming handler teams and contractor budgets in formal incident, paperwork is no longer consuming those things. I don't know what the board intends to rule. That's not my decision to make. What I know is that I have 4 more months on my contract, that the instruments need maintenance, and that Sek will be waiting in the Sector 11 chamber when I next go in. His ridge plates flat to his spine. Tev and Oreth will flank me through the passages. Vel will be on her shelf in Sector 8 waiting to tap my shoulder and possibly to present me with another pebble. The daughter Vel, the human one, starts at the Corandal Technical Academy next cycle. I sent her a message last week. She asked me what the cave was like. I told her it was quiet and cold and that I'd made some good friends there. She asked if they were other survey technicians. I said not exactly. She asked what they were. I thought about how to answer that for a while. Then I said, the kind of friends that make the place feel different when you're in it. She said that was a good kind. I should mention one other thing for the board's record, because I think it speaks to the nature of what has been developed here over these 9 months. Sek, the Vrail adult, has begun vocalizing in the audible range during our shared sessions in the Sector 11 chamber. Not subsonic, actual audible vocalization, in a frequency range I can hear clearly. It began in the 7th month, during a long afternoon session in which I was working through a maintenance anomaly in one of the main chamber sensors, and he had been lying in his rest posture 6 meters away for approximately 90 minutes. It started as something barely above the subsonic threshold, a tone I kept thinking was an instrument artifact before I confirmed it was biological. By the 8th month, it was consistent. By the 9th month, he was producing it reliably within the first 20 minutes of each session, and it lasted, with breaks, for as long as I was in the chamber. The behavioral literature I've been reading since starting at Vethkal is somewhat sparse on adult Vrail audible vocalization because it is apparently uncommon. Most of the behavioral ecology studies on Vrail adults don't document it at all. The one dedicated study on the subject suggests that adult Vrail produce audible vocalization almost exclusively in the context of confirmed territorial family acknowledgement, specifically in the presence of offspring or long-term bonded companions. The study is careful to note that the behavioral conditions required to observe it naturally are difficult to establish. I asked Duval about this in a message exchange after she returned to the regional hub. She confirmed the literature and added that in her 67 operations and 14 Vrail engagements, she had heard an adult Vrail vocalize audibly in that frequency range twice, both times in the presence of juveniles from the same clutch. I am not, to my knowledge, from Sek's clutch, but I am, apparently, from his territory now. And from his perspective, from the perspective of an animal whose behavioral architecture was shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution in cold places where patience was the survival trait that outlasted everything else, I gather that amounts to the same thing. I have 11 pebbles in my left jacket pocket, given to me one at a time over 9 months by a lone Sorvai who had no business being alone and found in an ice cave on the frontier margin of a world that the Compact has spent 11 years trying to properly survey, a way not to be. I have 2 subadult Keth predators who have decided that my left side and my right side are their designated positions in any passage narrower than 3 meters. I have a Vrail adult who has decided that the threshold of the main chamber is where he sleeps when I'm working, that his ridge plates are a reasonable indicator of his mood and mine, and that he'd like me to know when he's calm. I am a grade 3 survey technician, 19 years in the cold environment subfield. I work with numbers and ice and instruments that need steady hands and patience to calibrate properly. I am not, by any reasonable professional description, a handler. I am not, by any reasonable personal description, remarkable. I sat down on the ice and kept my notes and didn't run when running would have felt like the sensible thing to do. That's the complete account, to the best of my recollection and the record of my field notes. I'd like to go back to work now if the board doesn't mind. The Sector 11 instruments run their maintenance cycle at the 4th hour, and Sek knows when I'm late.